Hello! Welcome. Welcome. Sunday night, Monday morning, Monday afternoon. It's a time zone for you.
At my cousin's engagement party, my dad started choking. As we helped him up, he whispered, "Don't let them take me back there." I asked what he meant. He pointed at my uncle and collapsed. Later, I checked the address on the old letter. It was a psychiatric ward. The whole thing started at my cousin Brian's engagement party last month. You know how these family gatherings go. Everyone pretending to get along while nursing old grudges and nursing drinks that are way too strong. My dad had been acting weird all evening, constantly glancing over at my Uncle Harold like he was waiting for something bad to happen. We were all crowded around the appetizer table when my dad suddenly grabbed his throat and started making these horrible choking sounds. His face turned purple and he was clawing at his neck like something was stuck in there. My mom started screaming and Harold jumped up to help, but my dad pushed him away so violently that Harold nearly fell over the punch bowl. I grabbed my dad under his arms and started doing the Heimlich maneuver, but nothing came out. His eyes were bulging, and he was making these wet gasping sounds that still give me nightmares. Just when I thought we were going to lose him right there on the dining room floor, whatever was blocking his airway suddenly cleared, and he collapsed against me. That's when he whispered those words that changed everything. His voice was so hoarse I could barely make it out, but he grabbed my shirt and pulled me close. "Don't let them take me back there." His eyes were focused on something behind me, and when I turned around, Harold was standing there with this expression I'd never seen before. Not concern or relief that his brother was okay, but something else entirely. Something calculating. My dad pointed directly at Harold with a shaking finger, and then his eyes rolled back, and he passed out completely. The paramedics arrived about 10 minutes later and took him to the hospital, but by then Harold had disappeared. My mom said he probably went home because all the excitement was too much for him, but I knew better. People don't just vanish when their brother nearly dies unless they have a reason. At the hospital, my dad kept drifting in and out of consciousness. But every time he woke up, he would ask the same question. "Is Harold here?" When we told him no, he would relax back into the pillow like some terrible weight had been lifted off his chest. The doctors said he had suffered some kind of panic attack that caused his throat to constrict, but they couldn't explain what had triggered it. When we finally got him home the next day, I decided to do some digging. My dad had always been secretive about his past, especially his relationship with Harold. They were brothers, but acted more like strangers who happened to share the same last name. Family photos from before I was born always showed them standing as far apart as possible, and they never talked about their childhood or their parents. I started going through the old boxes in our basement, looking for anything that might explain what my dad meant about being taken back somewhere. Most of it was just typical family stuff: old tax returns, report cards, wedding photos. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a manila envelope hidden behind some Christmas decorations, and inside were dozens of letters addressed to my father. The return address was from someplace called Riverside Behavioral Health Center, and they were all dated from about 30 years ago. The letterhead had that official government look that immediately makes you think of bad news and bureaucratic nightmares. The first letter I opened was from a Dr. William Crane, and it was discussing my father's release conditions. Apparently, he had been a patient there for almost 2 years, and the letter outlined all the medications he needed to continue taking and the follow-up appointments he was required to attend. But here's the part that really got me. The letter mentioned that his admission had been arranged by his brother Harold, who had been granted power of attorney during my father's treatment. I sat there in that dusty basement reading letter after letter, and slowly the picture started coming together. My father had suffered some kind of mental breakdown in his early 20s, and Harold had him committed to this psychiatric facility. The letters talked about experimental treatments and therapy sessions, but they also mentioned something called the Meridian Project, which sounded way more sinister than regular mental health treatment. The last letter in the stack was different from the others. It was handwritten and signed by someone called Dr. Nathaniel Cross, and it was essentially a warning. It said that my father's case had been transferred to a different department within the facility, and that his family should be prepared for the possibility that he might not be the same person when he was eventually released. The letter ended with a cryptic line that made my skin crawl. "Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again." I grabbed the whole envelope and ran upstairs to confront my dad. But when I got to his room, he was sitting on the edge of his bed staring out the window with this haunted expression. He looked like he had aged 10 years since the party, and there were dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. When I showed him the letters, his face went completely white and his hands started shaking so badly he could barely hold the papers. He read through them silently, and then he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "I thought they had destroyed all of these," he said. "Harold promised me they were gone forever." That's when he started telling me the real story. According to my dad, Everything started when he was 22 years old and working at a chemical plant outside the city. He had always been a quiet person, but after a few months at the plant he started experiencing what he called episodes. He would lose time, sometimes for hours at a stretch, and when he came back to himself he would be in completely different locations with no memory of how he got there. At first he thought it was just stress from the job, but the episodes kept getting worse. He would find himself standing in the middle of busy intersections with no idea how he got there, or wake up in his car parked outside strangers' houses in neighborhoods he had never visited. Sometimes he would discover that he had apparently had entire conversations with people that he couldn't remember at all. The really scary part was that during these episodes, other people said he acted completely normal. His co-workers at the plant said he would show up for shifts and do his job perfectly well, but when he snapped out of it, he wouldn't remember working at all. It was like someone else was living his life for hours at a time, and he was just a passenger watching from the inside. Harold convinced him to see a psychiatrist, and that's where everything went sideways. The psychiatrist was a Dr. Cross, the same guy who had written that warning letter I found in the basement. Cross was supposedly a specialist in dissociative disorders, but according to my dad, he seemed way more interested in the episodes than in helping make them stop. Instead of trying to treat my dad's condition, Cross started encouraging the episodes. He would hypnotize my dad and try to bring out what he called the alternate personality, and then he would conduct these long interview sessions that my dad couldn't remember afterwards. Cross told Harold that my dad was suffering from multiple personality disorder and that the only way to cure him was through intensive treatment at a specialized facility. That facility was Riverside Behavioral Health Center, but my dad quickly realized it wasn't really a hospital at all. It was more like a research center, and the patients weren't being treated so much as they were being studied. Most of the other people there had similar stories. They all had some kind of dissociative condition, and they had all been referred by doctors who were connected to something called the Meridian Project. The Meridian Project was supposedly a government-funded research program designed to study multiple personality disorder and other dissociative conditions. But my dad said the real purpose was much darker than that. The researchers weren't trying to cure dissociation, they were trying to weaponize it. They wanted to create people who could be programmed with alternate personalities that could be activated on command. The treatment at Riverside involved a combination of drugs, hypnosis, and something they called cognitive restructuring. Patients would be given powerful hallucinogens and then subjected to hours of hypnotic programming while they were in altered states of consciousness. The goal was to create multiple distinct personalities within each patient, and then to establish triggers that could be used to switch between them. My dad said the process was incredibly traumatic and disorienting. He would go into a session as himself, and then wake up hours or sometimes days later with no memory of what had happened in between. But gradually he started to realize that something fundamental had changed about him. He could feel the presence of other personalities in his mind, like voices whispering just below the level of conscious awareness. The worst part was that Harold was involved in the whole thing. He wasn't just my dad's concerned brother trying to get him help. He was actually one of the researchers working on the Meridian Project. Harold had studied psychology in college and had been recruited by Dr. Cross while he was still a graduate student. When my dad started showing signs of dissociative episodes, Harold saw an opportunity to advance his own career by providing Cross with a test subject. Harold would visit my dad at Riverside and pretend to be the caring brother, but he was actually there to monitor my dad's progress and report back to the research team. He was the one who made sure my dad stayed at the facility even when he started asking to be released, and he was the one who signed the papers authorizing the more extreme experimental treatments. After almost 2 years at Riverside, my dad finally managed to escape. He had been pretending to be more affected by the treatments than he actually was, and he had been secretly working to suppress the alternate personalities that the researchers had created. One night during a fire drill, he slipped away from the group and made it to the main road where he hitchhiked back to the city. But the programming they had done to him didn't just disappear. For years afterwards, he would still have episodes where the alternate personalities would take control. The personalities had different names, different skills, and even different memories. Sometimes he would wake up to find that one of them had been living his life for days or weeks at a time, and he would have to piece together what had happened from the evidence they left behind. The personalities weren't random either. They had been specifically designed for different purposes. There was one that was trained in surveillance and reconnaissance, another that was skilled in combat and weapons handling, and a third that was basically a walking computer programmed with various technical skills. My dad said it was like having a whole team of specialists living inside his head, but he had no control over when they would appear or what they would do. Harold had kept in touch over the years, always claiming that he was just checking on his brother's well-being. But my dad knew the real reason. Harold was still monitoring him for the Meridian Project. The project might have officially ended, but the researchers were still interested in tracking their test subjects to see how the programming held up over time. My dad had managed to suppress most of the alternate personalities through sheer force of will and careful self-monitoring, but they were still there. He could feel them stirring sometimes, especially when he was under stress or when Harold was around. That's why he had reacted so violently when Harold tried to help him during the choking incident. Seeing Harold had triggered some kind of defensive response from one of the programmed personalities. As he finished telling me this story, my dad looked absolutely exhausted. But there was also something else in his expression, relief, maybe, that he had finally told someone the truth after all these years. Then he grabbed my arm and his voice got deadly serious. "Harold knows I told you," he said. "He always knows when the programming starts to break down. They'll be coming for me soon, and when they do, they're going to want to take me back to finish what they started." That's when we heard the car doors slamming outside. I looked out the window and saw 3 black sedans parked in our driveway. Men in dark suits were getting out of the cars, and Harold was standing on our front lawn talking to someone who looked like he was in charge. Even from the second floor, I could see that these weren't regular government agents or police officers. They moved with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested military training, and they were all wearing those earpiece things that Secret Service agents use. My dad saw them too and immediately went into panic mode. He started throwing clothes into a bag and telling me we needed to get out of the house immediately. But I could see that it was already too late. There were more men positioning themselves around the backyard, and someone was walking up the driveway toward the front door. The doorbell rang, and my dad froze like a deer in headlights. Then he did something that completely blew my mind. His entire demeanor changed in the space of about 2 seconds. The panicked, frightened man who had been telling me about the Meridian Project disappeared, and someone else entirely took his place. This new personality stood up straight, squared his shoulders, and started moving around the room with military efficiency. He checked the window locks, assessed possible escape routes, and then opened the bedroom closet and pulled out a gun case that I had never seen before. Inside was a disassembled sniper rifle and several boxes of ammunition. The personality put the rifle together in about 30 seconds, which was terrifying enough on its own, but then he started talking in a voice that sounded nothing like my dad. His accent was different, his vocabulary was more technical, and he seemed to know things about the house's layout and security that my dad had never mentioned. "This isn't a rescue operation," the personality said. "This is a retrieval." Harold activated the failsafe protocol, which means they're not planning to take him back to a facility. They're planning to eliminate him and recover the programming data for transfer to a new subject. I asked him who he was, and he looked at me like I was asking a stupid question. "I'm Operative Delta," he said. "I was created to handle exactly this type of situation. Your father has been suppressing us for decades, but the stress of disclosure has caused the barriers to break down. We're back online now, and we're going to make sure he survives this." While Delta was setting up the rifle at the bedroom window, I could hear people moving around downstairs. They had apparently gotten inside the house without breaking down the door, which suggested they had keys or some other way of bypassing our locks. I could hear Harold's voice giving orders, and it was clear that they were systematically searching the house room by room. Delta handed me a pistol and told me to watch the stairs while he dealt with the advance team in the backyard. I had never held a gun before in my life, but somehow the weapon felt familiar in my hands, like I had been trained to use it. That's when I realized that whatever they had done to my dad at Riverside, some of it had apparently been passed down to me. The first shot came from outside and shattered the bedroom window. Delta returned fire with the rifle, and I could hear someone screaming in the backyard. Then footsteps started pounding up the stairs, and I found myself moving into position behind the bedroom door without consciously deciding to do it. 3 men in tactical gear came through the doorway, and I shot all 3 of them before they could raise their weapons. The muscle memory was so strong that I barely had to aim. My hands just moved to the right positions and pulled the trigger at exactly the right moments. It was like watching someone else control my body, which I guess is exactly what was happening. Delta looked impressed. "Looks like the genetic component of the programming worked better than they expected," he said. "You're running operative gamma protocols right now, which means you inherited your father's combat conditioning." More shots were coming from downstairs, and I could hear Harold shouting orders about containing the situation and recovering the assets. Delta told me that we needed to get to the garage where my dad kept his old motorcycle, but first we had to make it through at least 6 more hostiles who were positioned between us and the exit. That's when another personality took over. This one moved differently than Delta, more fluid, more focused on stealth than direct confrontation. He identified himself as Operative Echo, and he seemed to know the exact locations of everyone in the house, even though he couldn't possibly have seen them. Echo led me through a route that avoided the main hallways and stairways. We went through the master bedroom, out onto the roof through a window, across to the garage, and then down through a maintenance hatch that I didn't even know existed. The whole time, he was providing commentary about the tactical situation and the best methods for neutralizing different types of opponents. We made it to the garage, but Harold and two other men were waiting for us. Harold was holding some kind of electronic device that looked like a cross between a remote control and a medical scanner, and when he pointed it at my dad, Echo immediately collapsed and my dad's original personality came back. The device was apparently some kind of neural disruptor that could shut down the programmed personalities by interfering with the specific brainwave patterns they operated on. Harold had been carrying it as insurance in case the alternate personalities activated during the retrieval operation. Harold looked older than I remembered, and there was something cold and calculating in his eyes that I had never noticed before. He told us that the Meridian project had never really ended. It had just gone underground and been transferred to private contractors. The research had continued for decades, and they had developed much more sophisticated techniques for creating and controlling programmed personalities. My dad, he said, represented a loose end that needed to be tied up. The original programming was breaking down after 30 years, and there was a risk that he might remember things about the project that were supposed to remain classified. The easiest solution was to bring him back in for what Harold called a complete neural restructuring. But there was something else. Harold said that they had been monitoring our family for years, and they had discovered that the programming had somehow been passed down to me through genetic inheritance. I was exhibiting the same dissociative episodes that my dad had experienced at my age, and I had apparently inherited at least some of the programmed personalities. That made me a valuable asset for the next phase of the project. Instead of having to start from scratch with new subjects, they could use me as a foundation and build on the programming that was already there. I would be easier to control than my dad because I didn't have 30 years of resistance built up, and I could be programmed with updated skills and knowledge that reflected current operational requirements. Harold raised the neural disruptor again, but before he could activate it, something incredible happened. All three of my dad's personalities came back online simultaneously, and instead of fighting for control, they started working together in perfect coordination. Delta handled the tactical planning, Echo managed the physical execution, and the third personality, who identified himself as Operative Zeta, took care of electronic countermeasures. Zeta somehow overloaded Harold's neural disruptor and caused a feedback loop that knocked out all the electronic equipment in the garage. In the confusion that followed, Delta and Echo managed to overpower Harold's men while Zeta hotwired the motorcycle. But as we were preparing to escape, Harold pulled out a backup device and hit my dad with some kind of neural shock that caused all three personalities to shut down at once. My dad collapsed to the garage floor, but this time when he woke up, he was someone completely different. The person who stood up from the garage floor looked like my dad, but everything else about him was wrong. His posture, his facial expressions, his voice. It was like watching a stranger wearing my father's face. He looked around the garage with clinical detachment, assessed the situation, and then walked over to Harold and stood at attention like a soldier reporting to his commanding officer. Harold smiled for the first time since this whole thing started. "Welcome back, Subject 7, he said. "It's been a long time." Subject 7 responded in a flat, emotionless voice that gave me chills. "Awaiting instructions, sir. All previous personality configurations have been successfully purged. I am ready for deployment." That's when I realized what had really happened at Riverside 30 years ago. They hadn't just created alternate personalities for my dad. They had completely replaced his original personality with programmed versions. The man I had grown up thinking was my father was actually Subject 7, the primary operational personality that had been designed to live a normal civilian life while remaining dormant until activated. Harold explained that the Meridian project had been far more successful than anyone had initially realized. They had developed a technique for completely rewriting human consciousness, essentially turning people into biological computers that could be programmed with any skills or personality traits required for specific missions. Subject 7 had been one of their most successful creations, and he had been living undercover for 3 decades while the project expanded into other areas. The episodes my dad had experienced over the years weren't breakdowns in the programming. They were actually updates being installed remotely. Harold and his team had been using him as a test subject for new techniques and technologies, essentially treating him like a living laboratory for consciousness research. But now they had encountered a problem. The original programming was becoming unstable, and Subject 7 was starting to develop something that resembled actual human emotions and memories. This was interfering with his operational effectiveness, and there was a risk that he might become completely independent of their control. The solution was to bring him in for what Harold called a final upgrade. They would strip away all the accumulated human experiences and emotions, and replace them with a more advanced version of the Subject 7 personality. The new version would be completely loyal to the project and incapable of developing independent thoughts or feelings. Harold turned to me and explained that I would be undergoing a similar process. The genetic inheritance of the programming meant that I already had the neural pathways necessary for multiple personalities, but they needed to be properly formatted and configured. Once that was done, I would become Subject 8, and I would be deployed alongside Subject 7 for a new mission that had been in development for years. The mission involved infiltrating various government agencies and private corporations to gather intelligence and carry out operations that couldn't be traced back to the project. Subject 7 would be assigned to defense contractors and military organizations, while Subject 8 would focus on technology companies and research institutions. Together, we would form a two-person sleeper cell that could remain dormant for years before being activated for specific objectives. Harold activated another device, and I felt something like an electric shock run through my brain. The world started to blur around the edges, and I could feel my consciousness being pulled in different directions. It was like having multiple television channels playing in my head at once, with different voices and personalities all trying to take control at the same time. But then something unexpected happened. The genetic inheritance that Harold had mentioned turned out to be more complex than they had realized. Instead of just receiving programmed personalities from my dad, I had apparently inherited his original personality as well, the one that had existed before the Meridian Project got to him. That original personality started fighting back against the programming, and it was stronger than anything Harold's team had encountered before. It began systematically shutting down the artificial personalities they were trying to install, and it started pulling up memories and experiences that had been buried for decades. I could suddenly remember things that had never happened to me. Childhood memories from before my dad was taken to Riverside, conversations with my grandparents who had died before I was born, and most importantly, knowledge about how the Meridian Project's programming actually worked. The original personality had been a brilliant engineer who had been working on classified projects before his breakdown. Harold and Dr. Cross had specifically targeted him because of his technical knowledge, and they had used that knowledge to help develop the consciousness transfer technology. But they had made a mistake. They had never completely erased his memories. They had just buried them under layers of programmed personalities. Now those memories were coming back, and with them came the knowledge of how to reverse the programming process. The original personality started broadcasting some kind of neural signal that began waking up the suppressed personalities in Subject 7. Delta, Echo, and Zeta came back online, but this time they weren't following their original programming. They were being controlled by my dad's original consciousness. Harold realized what was happening and tried to use the neural disruptor again, but it was too late. The feedback loop between my inherited memories and my dad's suppressed personality had created something that the Meridian Project had never anticipated, a consciousness that existed partially in both of us at the same time. Working together, we managed to overpower Harold and his remaining men. But instead of just escaping, the original personality had a different plan. Using the technical knowledge he had possessed before the programming, he started systematically destroying all the electronic equipment in the garage and downloading the contents of Harold's devices. The information he retrieved was incredible. The Meridian Project hadn't just been experimenting on a few dozen subjects. They had been running operations for decades, creating hundreds of programmed personalities and inserting them into positions throughout government, military, and corporate hierarchies. Some of the most influential people in the country were actually subject personalities who had been designed to carry out specific agendas. But the project was also falling apart. The consciousness transfer technology was inherently unstable, and many of the subject personalities were beginning to break down or develop independence. Harold's team had been desperately trying to develop more reliable programming techniques, and they had been planning to use my dad and me as test subjects for a new generation of biological computers. The original personality made copies of all the data and then set fire to the garage. As we escaped on the motorcycle, we could see smoke rising behind us and hear explosions as Harold's equipment was destroyed. But we both knew that this was just the beginning. The Meridian Project had facilities and operatives all over the country, and they would not give up easily. 3 months later, my dad and I are living under assumed names in a small town about 1,000 miles away from where we started. The original personality has managed to completely suppress the Subject 7 programming. And for the first time in 30 years, my dad is actually himself again. He's different from the person I grew up with, more confident, more technically minded, and with a sense of humor that I never knew he had. We've been systematically releasing the information we recovered from Harold's devices to journalists and government investigators, but progress is slow. Many of the people who should be investigating the Meridian Project are actually subject personalities themselves, and they have been working to suppress or discredit our evidence. But we're not giving up. The original personality has been working on developing countermeasures for the consciousness transfer technology, and we've managed to make contact with other people who escaped from similar programs. It turns out that the Meridian Project was just one of several related research efforts, and there are potentially thousands of programmed personalities operating throughout society. Harold was found dead a week after the garage incident, apparently killed by his own people who considered him a security risk. But before he died, he managed to send a message warning us that the project would never stop hunting us. They consider us to be stolen property, and they will use every resource at their disposal to either recapture us or eliminate us. So that's where we stand now. We're living under constant threat from an organization that has spent decades perfecting the art of turning human beings into biological machines, and we're probably the only people who fully understand how their technology works. Every day we wake up not knowing if this will be the day they finally track us down, but we also know that we might be the only hope for all the other victims who are still trapped in their programming. The strangest part is that I've started having my own episodes again, but these are different from the programmed personalities that Harold tried to install. These feel like inherited memories from people I've never met, other victims of similar projects, other original personalities who managed to hide pieces of themselves before being overwritten. It's like there's an entire underground network of suppressed consciousnesses that are trying to communicate with each other across the barriers that the programmers built. My dad thinks that the genetic inheritance might be more widespread than we realized, and that there might be thousands of people walking around with dormant original personalities buried beneath their programmed identities. If we could find a way to wake them all up simultaneously, we might be able to bring down the entire system from the inside. But that's a story for another day. Right now, we're just focused on staying alive and staying free, and hoping that someday we'll be able to help all the other people who are still trapped in their artificial lives, not knowing that their real selves are still buried somewhere deep inside their programmed minds. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.